Welcome everybody. We might make a start. My name's Roger Darville-Stevens. I'm the National Fraud and Forensic Services Partner and at RSM Australia, and I'm joined by my colleagues and co-presenters here. So you have Directors Michael Cassidy, who's based in Perth, and Director Andrew Connolly, who's based in Sydney, and Senior Manager Malin Sheff, based in Melbourne. So appreciate you attending and registering. We have in excess of 300 registrants who will either be on this webinar or will be watching via replay at a later stage. And it's best practice, fraud control and forensic accounting and investigation, client case studies from the trenches. So as I said before, happy International Fraud Awareness Week. We do a national RSM free webinar each year at this time, which we find clients and our business contacts find very beneficial. I'd like to move to the next slide on an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters on which we live and work. We pay respect to elders past and present as the custodians of their culture and continuous connect to country. So I'm just delighted to present our webinar this year. Last year, we presented some sort of fraud insights and latest points. But this year, if you can go back, Allegra, just to the that slide, thank you. But this year, we're going to look at a number of client case studies of which I hope you can relate, either whether you're in the private sector, public sector, a law firm, and one or many of these case studies may resonate and you might learn some takeouts from it. And of course, may want to then follow up and have a chat about a bespoke discussion in relation to your own business needs. So thank you, Allegra. The next slide. So I wanted to start with a couple of case studies. And myself and my forensic colleagues see this development all the time of latest and greatest techniques in fraud. And you may or may not have seen this case study, but so we've got a level playing field. We just wanted to mention this latest technique of using deep fakes. So this case study in particular is, as it says, a finance worker pays out $25 million after video call with Deepfake chief financial officer. So it's an employee in finance at a multinational firm, this is in Hong Kong, was tricked out of 200 million Hong Kong dollars or 37 million Australian dollars to fraudsters using deepfake technology. They posed as the company's chief financial officer and other employees in a video conference call. The interesting part of this is the employee in finance actually had used his professional skepticism and had some suspicions and concerns. So when he received a message that was purportedly from the company's UK-based CFO, he thought, this is suspicious. This isn't ringing a bell. Maybe it's a phishing email, as it talked of the need for a secret transaction to be carried out, which was a red flag for this finance person. So he did the right thing, but he put aside his doubts after he had a video conference call with what he thought was the CFO and other colleagues who convinced him that it was real. So believing everyone else on the call was real, the employee agreed to remit a total of that 200 million Hong Kong, 37 million Australian or 25.6 million US dollars. Could happen to anyone. It's the latest and greatest in fraud type techniques, you know, to actually defraud an organisation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the next one, it's just the second and last case study. The most common types of fraud we get to investigate for clients is procurement fraud. It is so endemic of conflicts of interest, of gift benefits, hospitality, all sorts of things that are enshrined in the money flow of needing to procure goods and services and to make sure that process has integrity and probity. So this one is called Fat Leonard. It's an unfortunate name, but if you Google it, the reason why it's called Fat Leonard is they call it rotund stature at the time of these offences. So his name is Leonard Francis, and he's been sentenced just now to 15 years in prison for the worst ever corruption scandal in the US Navy over many decades. So the Malaysian military contractor wooed naval officers with decadent gifts and services, and a federal court ordered him to repay $20 million in restitution US to the US Navy. And you can see an extract of the court transcript here. And so he supplied food, water and fuel to vessels of the American Navy ships at ports across Asia for decades. But what he did was he wooed those naval officers for that work by providing decadent gifts and services. And you can have a look at this extract, and you can, if I read down it, it says, basically hundreds of thousands of dollars in travel expenses, including airfares, often first or business class, luxurious hotel stays, incidentals with spa treatments, hundreds of thousands of dollars in lavish meals, top shelf alcohol and wine, and entertainment, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in luxury gifts, including designer handbags, leather goods, watches, Cuban cigars, etc., as well as prostitutes and associated expenses. So very unfortunate, not isolated to that region. These things happen here, and you've probably seen it in the media on occasions. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kick off, and I will ask each of our presenters, of Michael, Andrew and Malin, to introduce themselves. By way of introduction to me, I've been at RSM Australia as the Head of Fraud and Forensic Services for 9 years now. Prior to that, at another firm, professional service firm out of the Big Four, EY, for 13 years, and then originally in the police force in uniform areas all over the place, and then also as a detective, including at the drug squad, fraud squad, and a counter-terrorist area, as well as a couple of stints in the private sector, a Ford Motor Company and a large insurance company. All involved in detecting and preventing and investigating fraud, bribery, corruption and other misconduct. I've also got the range of qualifications you'd expect: an MBA, a Master of Arts Criminology, Certified Fraud Examiner, Licensed Investigator and Commonwealth Government Security Clearance. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kick off with the first case study. And we've anonymised this to just keep it anonymous for client information. So this was through a long-standing relationship with this client and a key executive in particular. And he had the responsibility of fraud and corruption control. And we were engaged because they had an immature fraud, bribery and corruption control system or framework. Essentially, all it comprised of was a one-page fraud policy and sporadic controls in varying business processes. So that executive and his co-executives were concerned that they weren't focusing enough on this key business risk of fraud, bribery and corruption. So they engaged us to do a holistic fraud, bribery and corruption control phased engagement. So the left-hand column is the issues and challenges they faced. They did not know what they did not know. So what that means is that without a risk assessment, a fraud, bribery and corruption risk assessment, they didn't know where they were exposed in what areas and where to put their resources and monitor other areas that may not need that level of resourcing. So there was a lack of anti-fraud expertise also in the business, and what is legislatively required and what is best practice or better practice. And so in the absence of a position on fraud, bribery and corruption risk appetite, they didn't know what they didn't know. So the scope we were given was following a fraud investigation that was performed by us under legal professional privilege. We assisted the business and verified certain business processes. We had a look at their one-page fraud, bribery and corruption control policy and revised that. We then operationalised that in a fraud, bribery and corruption control plan, which is a policy procedure in one, if you like, and developed a fraud, bribery and corruption risk assessment so that they knew exactly what risks their business was exposed to. And then looking at identifying those risks, identifying the controls that relate to those risks and rating according to consequences and likelihood of residual risk of what's left. And the high rated risks to get more attention than the monitored low rated risks. But it also set a benchmark or a baseline or an established base for their fraud, bribery and corruption control system or framework. We also delivered multiple fraud, bribery and corruption control awareness training session for employees. And we did a fraud, bribery and corruption employee awareness survey, which we find to be super beneficial for clients because they get an absolute insight into employees' thinking and experiences that they may not get from other means. On the right-hand column, you can see the procedures we performed. We developed and delivered on that scope and suite of services in a phased approach. It's often too much for an organisation to do all in one hit, and it's sequentially based. For example, if you do the training too early, an employee is going to say, well, where's that policy procedure? Oh, that's a work in progress, or we've only got a one-page policy and that's all, and we're going to work on the other things. The training is a great opportunity to reinforce those messages and tone from the top, middle and grassroots. In addition, the Corporations Act whistleblower legislative reforms came into place in January 2020 to take into account, so some legislative changes. And we provided also investigative support on reports of alleged or suspected fraud as provided from respondents, believe it or not, to the awareness survey to the whole population of employees. So we just did a survey monkey survey on some very key questions, and some of those respondents identified some actual or potential alleged fraud, bribery and corruption that required investigation. Next slide, please. So the procedures we performed on that left-hand column there, we made sure that what we put in place and set up and help the organisation implement were consistent with the Australian standard AS 8001/2021 on fraud and corruption control, which is seen by private and public sector organisations as the better practice to follow and customise to their organisation. We also used, of course, ISO 31000 standard on risk management principles and guidelines. There was an anti-bribery management systems international standard, which we utilised, whistleblower management systems and guidelines standard 37002, and relevant legislation, in this case, the Corporations Act. For many other clients in, for example, the public sector, there's public interest disclosure legislation that relates to them. And we also use better practice guides. There's a lot of excellent guides. For example, if you Google the Commonwealth Fraud Prevention Centre, even though that's a Commonwealth government site, it provides a lot of great insight and information into better practice fraud and corruption control. The project time was, we did from April 2021 to March 2022. As I said, it was a phased approach by our team, and so it required that. The findings and the themes, the client used a steering committee approach to for this project, with the leader coordinator being the client project sponsor that I mentioned before, that key executive that I've known for a long time. And that was quite good because we could report back to the steering committee, get instructions and guidance from them and make sure the client was in the position to make decisions and move into different areas. For example, the answers to the survey suggesting an investigation is required, and if they wanted help, which they did. A fraud, bribery and corruption risk assessment allowed the client to assess what risks were really relevant to their business and what and how adequate their controls were to mitigate those risks. The client felt better prepared for any external scrutiny, such as they did get government funding for certain projects. And so even though they are a private company operating in Australia mainly, but also a couple of overseas operations, they needed to make sure they were legislative compliant with Commonwealth government requirements as well, and better practice to assure stakeholders of effective management of their business. As I said, the staff survey high points were 6,000 employees, 12% response rate, which you might say is not great. We kind of hope for 20 to 30%, but you can never guarantee that. But still, that's a good sample and amount of people responding. It led to reports of suspected fraud and multiple investigations that otherwise would not have been discovered at all. So after the initial heavy lifting by our team of this project to implement a program of fraud, bribery and corruption control system or framework, management then embedded this ongoing into monitoring and then tweaking as they go, rather than, you know, this was the wholesale investment at the beginning that then can be managed effectively as they progressed. So happy to answer any questions at the end. And I forgot to mention, feel free to put in any questions as you think about them in the QA, and we'll leave the questions towards the end for any of the speakers or any of us generally on any general topics. So I'll now, next slide, please. I have a couple of quick points. You'll get a copy of these slides in the recording, but just to reinforce, for those uninitiated, this is the Australian Standard AS 8001 2021 summarised. It's got a whole lot of key, it's basically an excellent checklist, and then have a look at what resonates and is relevant to your business. And it's a great structure and framework for you to go through. Next slide, please. Also, it's worth asking in your own organisation who really owns fraud in your organisation. Everybody owns it, but what executive, usually delegated by the lead CEO or lead government executive in an organisation, who looks after that and coordinates the operationalisation of your fraud and corruption control system? There should be a person who coordinates that. And if you don't know, it needs some attention. Next slide, please. Just very briefly, there's global bribery and corruption, as well as domestic fraud, bribery and corruption. It's estimated that 5% of the world's GDP, or $5 trillion US, is lost due to global bribery and corruption. Next slide, please. So if you have operations overseas or anything overseas, an import, exporting, use agents or intermediaries, or have a shelf company or a business presence overseas, you're likely to be captured by the Australian foreign bribery corruption laws that were recently amended in 2024, literally September this year. So next slide, please. So I'll finish off by saying that here's a brief summary of those updates. For example, there's a new failure to prevent foreign bribery corporate offence that directors and companies can be charged with, that the only defence, the corporate defence to that, is that you already have a compliance program of adequate procedures in place to mitigate these foreign bribery risks, and that what happened was a maverick event, not a systemic issue for the organisation. It also expands existing foreign bribery offences and has larger corporate penalties, as you can see there, $31 million, etc. So I welcome you to reach out to any of us if you want to talk further about that in the future weeks, if this is relevant to your organisation. Next slide, please. And just briefly to say, that case study I mentioned, they said, well, where do we go for training to equip our own staff to be able to manage our fraud and corruption control system or framework ongoing? So there is a certified fraud examiner credential called the CFE that's awarded by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, a global organisation. And you can do an online course and self-paced study, or you can register for a 4-day instructor-led course, which in Australia, we happen to be the exclusive authorised trainers for that. These are the 2024 dates, but we've just released the 2025 dates, which are in similar months. And there's a full day on investigation principles, a full day on international legal principles, a full day on financial transactions and fraud schemes, and a full day on fraud prevention and deterrence. Next slide, thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Michael and he can introduce himself and then go through his case study. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Roger. Good morning, everyone. My name's Michael Cassidy. I'm a director at RSM in the Perth office. I've over 20 years experience in fraud risk management and risk advisory services. I was a partner at another firm until recently, and have also worked for some government regulators over the years. Just to add to Roger about the CFE qualification, I did it myself about 10 years ago through the self-study. So if I'm pretty capable of doing it, I'm sure most others would be as well. I'm just going to talk briefly today about a case study regarding some cash embezzlement and use of corporate credit card. The credit card is quite topical because at the moment, a lot of organisations use credit cards, and the main risk is it's being used to circumvent any purchasing policies or procedures. So if I can just go to the first slide. So I was asked by a government agency just to have a look at their petty cash reimbursement function. The client's concern was an employee had responsibility for petty cash when and cashed a cheque on the guise that it was going to be used to replenish the petty cash. As a result, the cash actually went missing for a number of days. When the employee was queried about where the cash was, the reason given was, I just had another handbag and left it at home for those days. And the money did turn up eventually, but there was some concerns over what it was used for in the meantime. The petty cash function was entirely paper-based. So in order to look at our work, which involved reconciling petty cash for a 2-year period, we had to go back through over 100 archive boxes of documents. So the types of transactions that were typically used for petty cash were reimbursements for small items, coffee, lunches, but the main concern we identified going through the policies and procedures, and there was no real policies and procedures in a written form or any documentation as to what petty cash was to be used for. What we identified was anyone who was travelling to a remote area was entitled to make a cash advance to cover their travel costs in advance of then claiming at a later date the government travel rate, which was essentially the daily amount they could get for each day they travelled. So this was performed through the petty cash. We identified early on that these were a significant number of transactions and regularly recurring transactions through the petty cash function at this particular agency. So if we called all the archive boxes back and we started to reconcile it, the main focus really was on the travel advances, because what we were identifying was there was a significant number of travel advances being made over the 2-year period to the same number of individuals, whereby they were getting the cash advance. We also, as a result, had to go and get the travel advance forms back from the archive function so we could reconcile the advances to the travel that was undertaken. We also looked to expand our remit to look at credit cards, because although this person was a fairly low-level public servant, they did have access to a corporate credit card that they were able to make purchases through, once again, on the direction, supposedly, of senior people or others in the organisation to purchase travel, people going to remote areas, stationery, lunches, and things like that. The other work we undertook was we looked to obviously prepare schedules and a report for the agency in the first instance. Just have the next slide, please. So over the 3-month engagement, we looked at over 100 petty cash transactions, and we went through the employee emails as well, just trying to identify any relevant information relating to how the petty cash transactions were actually affected. Was it employees emailing them saying, I need some money to travel, or a cash advance, or can you pay for this, or can you use this purchase credit card? We traced the credit card transactions through the supports, and we obviously, at this stage, we were starting to have some concerns around the travel advances, because what was occurring was the travel advances were being falsified for people who weren't travelling, who had no awareness that they're actually being used. A number of people were identified. So as a result of trying to trace the petty cash travel advances to the travel forms when they came back, there was no form. So the person hadn't travelled. So there was no subsequent reimbursement for other travel-related costs. So we identified through our analysis that, that was how the petty cash was being manipulated for people who weren't travelling. Essentially, the person was putting through a false travel advance, taking the cash, and it just sat there, never to be reconciled later. There was a number of red flags in the corporate cards where, we identified through looking at corporate cards, a holiday for the family was purchased on the card, a mobile phone. There was poor controls over the petty cash. So through our work, we actually found there was no written policies and procedures over the use of petty cash. The petty cash was never actually reconciled monthly. There was never any regular or informal cash counts performed on the petty cash, so you never knew what the balance was or were in a position to reconcile it. The only basis for a top-up petty cash was the individual just making a request. There was no justification or anything provided to substantiate the reason for the additional cash. So from our work, we identified a number of issues relating to controls over the use of the petty cash function, controls over the use of the corporate credit card. So the corporate credit card was never reviewed or checked by anyone. There was no policy or procedure relating to the use of the card or what it could be used for. Throughout our work, we were always mindful that we may need to speak to the individual that was involved. So we did speak to that person at the end of the engagement. Confessions were made by that person during the interview as to the money that was misappropriated. We also then moved to the stage where we need to prepare a report for the police, or also used for the agency to use with their insurers. So in summary, there was a number of learnings for the agency out of this engagement. First and foremost was just around their policies and procedures for petty cash. There was an assumption incorrectly made that internal audit were going to look at it, but they never had. There was never any fraud risk assessment performed around petty cash for the use of credit card. There was no formal fraud risk management policies or procedures at the agency. The general theme was it was always someone else's responsibility for fraud risk management rather than the management of the agency. There was a lack of oversight. For a paper-based system, we had a lot of difficulty actually obtaining the records, purely and simply because of the volume, but it became pretty apparent towards the end of the engagement, the paper-based records were our greatest source, because it really identified the scale of petty cash transactions that were being put through the travel advances, and then it showed the lack of control or lack of awareness around the ability to circumvent the system by not having a subsequent travel claim form later for the person that was supposedly travelling. There was no reconciliation between the two until we looked at it. So like I said, one of the big issues we also identified as well was the use of the corporate credit card to circumvent purchasing policies and procedures, because some of the purchases that were being made would quite clearly not have been purchased by any other method. Once again, there was no oversight or use, or more importantly, a policy for the employee to follow that they could later then be held to. I'll just hand over to Andrew now, who's got another case study for you. And thanks for everyone's time.
Thanks, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm a director in the Sydney office of RSM. I've joined relatively recently, having most recently been at a specialist advisory firm that specialises in restructuring and forensic matters, and have previously worked in Big Four, and initially started my career similar to Roger in the police force, except in the New South Wales Police Force, and specialising in investigations, working in the detective's office, working on all sorts of criminal matters, including frauds, drug matters, homicides, and organised crime. So I might just start on the next slide, please. So the matter I'm going to talk today, as Roger mentioned, has been anonymised, and it has been through the judicial system, and it's come to an end in the last couple of months. There's been a judicial outcome, but it relates to a procurement fraud, and it was a client that we've worked with over the course of a number of years, and built a relationship with them to the point we were a trusted advisor to them. So quite often there would be an issue where they needed some forensic accounting, and we were their first point of call. So the client is a large Australian mining company, and they received through their whistleblower service a protected disclosure that did allege some inappropriate procurement practices that were being adopted by some of their employees at a particular mining site. And those allegations alleged that those staff internal at the mining company were receiving and or demanding kickbacks, whether it was in the form of cash or motor vehicles. And what they were offering was, if you give us that cash, we'll make sure you're put forward as a selected tenderer to provide services to the mining company. So we assisted our client, the mining company, investigate those claims and provide that independence to assist them work through that matter. So there was a number of serious matters that were raised, and accordingly there are some issues and challenges that we have to work through. And foremost is protecting the identity and the safety of the whistleblower. As that matter was an ongoing matter as opposed to an historical matter, it was live. We also had to bear in mind that there's the opportunity for the alleged perpetrators to cooperate amongst themselves and destroy evidence. And this was hampered even more the fact that this particular site was a semi-rural site. Accordingly, it's a small community town where the whistleblower and the alleged perpetrators and the tenderer all live in quite close proximity to one another. That also causes issue for us as the external advisor and going in there as accountants. And it makes it difficult when you're going into a small office trying to obtain information to undertake our review without tipping any of these perpetrators off. And again, giving them that opportunity to destroy evidence. Also, as I mentioned, as this is an ongoing matter and it's considered live, we do have a higher likelihood of getting police engagement to investigate this matter. and without knocking the police, because I am a former police officer, some frauds can be a little difficult to get their buy-in and interest, particularly if it's a relatively low quantum of funds, or in this case, you don't know what the quantum of fraud is. So until you do some initial preliminary investigations, it is hard to get that buy-in. But the fact that it was live and ongoing did assist and work in our favour. But also, we have sort of an issue where we need to balance the client's reputation and also make sure they're compliant with their legislative requirements to notify law enforcement. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So we worked with our client, developed a scope, and initially we're going to undertake an initial covert review to determine the veracity of the allegations, to consider where there's merit in referring that to law enforcement or what other actions we could take. So just to point out there, this is specific to New South Wales. So in New South Wales, under the Crimes Act, Section 316, you are required to bring to the attention of law enforcement if you know or believe a serious indictable offence has been committed. So if you don't do that, it is a criminal offence in New South Wales. So we worked with the client. We discussed what potential procedures could be performed and particularly what value we could add. But ultimately, the client did want to refer this to the police. So we need to undertake a covert investigation, short and sharp, and really determine what's going on here and how can we assist, and essentially package this up for the police to investigate further. So we discussed that prime activities we could undertake were review or identify what electronic communication there is, whether that's emails, mobile phone records, undertake searches on OSINT through public available databases, and also undertake a forensic analysis of both current tenders that have been put to the market and previously awarded tenders, and just see what concentration risk is there in respect of what tenders have been awarded to different tenderers. So I'll just pop over to the next slide, please. So once we'd undertaken those initial steps, we said to the client, we can undertake X, Y, and Z and really advance those investigations. So we were able to meet with the whistleblower, which was really important because that provided us additional valuable information. And of course, we had to make sure we protect their identity. We were able to assist the client secure and review electronic evidence that included emails and phone records between the alleged perpetrators. And we were unable to undertake that limited sample review of tenders and identify that there was a concentration risk in respect of what tenders were awarded. And ultimately, we were able to facilitate and act as a conduit between the client and law enforcement that included facilitating an introduction with the whistleblower. So as the investigation progressed, some of our key findings and what we identified were we were able to establish a link between the perpetrators that were employed at the mining company and the tenderer. This wasn't disclosed, and this ultimately was an undisclosed conflict of interest. Further, we were able to identify that those perpetrators at the mining company were involved in both the drafting, reviewing, and the awarding of tenders, and that clearly represents a lack of segregation of duties. We were able to assist law enforcement in obtaining the cooperating evidence they require for them to establish their investigation. Accordingly, police were able to covertly monitor the perpetrators, and they gained enough evidence to undertake coordinated search warrants where they were arrested, charged, and like I said, recently have been convicted. So for the client, some of the key takeaways were identified was they were quite surprised and astonished that even with the seniority of these perpetrators, it was a small, close-knit workplace built on trust. It was clear that there was a lack of controls and they just weren't working. To their praise, they also had an effective whistleblowing program that brought this matter to light. I'll just pop over to the next slide, please. So just back on that, our client luckily had an effective whistleblower program, But just to point out, there are some red flags where a whistleblower program is less than effective. And look, some of those red flags can be there's an absence of clear ownership, or there's a confusion as to who looks after what. There can also be employee mistrust. They don't feel confident reporting a matter. They maybe want their identity to be maintained confidentially, and there's just a lack of trust there. There also can be outdated report logging processes, and I think that's important, that whistleblower programs have to be innovative and adapt with the time. Also, there's no point having a program if there's a lack of awareness and no one knows actually how to report it or where the policy is. And you need that management buy-in. That tone needs to be set from the top. So just one more slide, I think. So if you're interested, if your company or organization is interested in developing or implementing a whistleblower program, RSM does offer one. So a bit of a plug there. Roger leads that program, and particularly there is a requirement now for public and large proprietary companies to make sure they do have a compliant whistleblower policy in place. We can assist you to develop that, and equally we run an outsourced system where people can call up or email and report anonymously any issues they may identify. And then I believe that's it. I don't think there's any more slides. I'll hand you over now to Melinda, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. So Melinda Sheth is my name. I'm a senior manager in Melbourne, working very closely with Roger and our team. So just a bit about myself. I started off so I'm an accountant by background. I've got my chartered accounting degree, and I started off as a forensic accountant, working with on loss of profits and quantifying damages. And I spent my entire career in professional services. I've also worked from there at Big Four, at Deloitte, expanding on the fraud and forensics area into investigations and the preventative work of, fraud risk assessments, training, and the likes, and then on to now at RSM. So always been an accountant. I've got the certified fraud examiner credential, masters in accounting, cert 3, 4, etc., that you collect along the way. I might also add that, we are a big fan of the ACFE and the work that they do. I'm the current vice president and treasurer of the ACFE Melbourne chapter, and I do stay in touch with a lot of the other chapters across the country. So if anyone's interested, I'm more than happy to link you in with one of them wherever you are in the country. They run great seminars, webinars, in-person events, from speaking to former whistleblowers to Victoria Police or New South Wales Police, etc. So just if you want, please reach out to myself. Just on the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about 2 case studies, and it's the first one is a forensic accounting case study, and both the case studies I'll touch on is, we've been engaged by a law firm. A lot of the investigations that we undertake are through law firms. It could be external law firms or in-house counsel within your own organization. So the first one, underpayment of wages, it is all over the news. You would have seen the likes of, started literally from 7-Eleven, where they were in the media, and it just, snowballed from there. The Fair Work Ombudsman, is right on top of it. And then all along, you'll see other organizations either fined for, underpaying their staff. So in this case study, this was actually a good one on behalf of our client, because they did a self-review and they were looking at their books and records and just making sure that they had paid their staff correctly. What they'd undertaken internally, they started to see some irregularities and trying to make sure that they paid their staff under the awards correctly. And once they started seeing some anomalies, they contacted their their lawyers, their counsel, and they said, look, I think there's an issue here. We want to just get an independent review undertaken for us to ensure that, if we have underpaid our staff, we want to make sure we rectify that problem. So we were engaged by this law firm, and it was under legal professional privilege to ensure that if this ever gets litigious, there are mechanisms in place. What we needed to do was work through 5 years worth of data, and it was over 225 employees. And they wanted to make sure that, all the source documentation was there. We could review it, we can understand it, and base our calculations on that. Now, the problem that we had and the challenges was a lot of the timesheet records was manual. It wasn't automated. It didn't feed into a central system. This client of ours in the educational sector had different areas, different office locations. So a lot of the timesheets were done on that spot, and it wasn't centralized in any which way. So it was very difficult to gather all that information. So it was a key challenge we had. And then, it's a complex area, underpayment of wages. So there was obviously everything from interpreting the awards, the contracts, from casual employees, part-time employees, weekends, after hours, overtime. So there was lots of interpretations that, we worked closely with the lawyers because, we're accountants, we're investigators, we're not lawyers. So we work with lawyers to interpret that and, give us instructions as, this is what you should consider. So moving on from there, so the scope was literally, looking at the self-audit that they had done internally, providing assurance on that process, and then confirming from their understanding if, the underpayments that they had identified for Saturday work, that was the main issue that they had looked into. And more importantly, the casual employees, if, they had calculated that correctly. And then instead of doing a whole population, we suggested in discussions with the client that, look, let's start on a sample basis, see what we come up with. And then if you'd like, we can increase that sample size at a later point. So it was on a sample basis. The procedures that we did in this underpayment of wages investigation was obviously, discussing with them, understanding what process they undertook internally, what documents they reviewed, understand their model that they had created and their assumptions, which went into that model. We got all their source documentation as the best as we could and what was available. So it was, the spreadsheet that they had drafted, obviously the timesheet records, pay slips, obviously a key source of information that we require, any employment contracts in relation to the sample of employees, and, interestingly enough, the email correspondence, because there might be some emails floating around which says, look, this individual has now gone from Saturday work to Sunday work or vice versa, and the hours have changed. So, making sure we get that evidence, which was crucial. And then obviously analyzing and then drafting the report for the client. So just on the next slide there, please. So, as I mentioned, what we did, we did the analysis going based on what was provided to us. And what did we find? So at a summary level, yes, what the client had identified was indeed correct, which was really good for the client that they had picked it up. But we did obviously find additional information, additional underpayments for the client's benefit. So for example, there was 20 occasions where casual employees had worked, on a particular shift for Saturday, but they were paid for less than 2 hours. In the contracts, in the bargaining agreements, you had to pay an employee for a minimum of 2 hours. And there was occasions where 20 occasions where it was not happening. Additionally, another 95 occasions where an casual employee worked multiple shifts, at least one of those shifts being less than 2 hours. So that was another finding we had. And then, 4,616 timesheets where casual employees had worked on a weekday, but was paid again under the less of 2 hours. Just on a control weakness perspective, the fourth bullet point there, timesheet records. So of the ones that we sampled, 217 of them, the employer actually did not sign off the employee's timesheet. So just, at your own organization, it's a good control to have that, whatever time that someone has purported to work, make sure that's ticked off and approved before it's been uploaded into your centralized system. The key takeaway, is exactly that. The client was correct in their suspicion. And again, it was good from a preventative approach. They did their own review. They thought there was an issue. They got their lawyers involved, who then got us involved to conduct this review. The second case study I'd like to talk about, please, on the next slide, is again through a law firm. And this was not on underpayment of wages, but this was misappropriation of assets from a deceased estate. So what had happened in this example or in this engagement was the estate belonged to the late father of our client. They were being called in to understand what was happening to the estate. There were multiple marriages in this example, so it was a messy environment that they were in. And one of the other challenges was that the father had the health deteriorated quite rapidly at the end of his life. So we were engaged again under legal professional privilege. We had to look through 7 years worth of information and lots and lots of records, business records, real estate records, share records, anything that we could get our hands on or what we were provided with to essentially recreate accounts, understand where the monies went. And a lot of the source documentation that we were provided by a client was not complete or clear. So it was definitely a challenging engagement, but what we were asked to do is essentially, see if we could see any misappropriation of the late father's assets, including the superannuation accounts, etc., and provide our own opinion in an expert report. If we could generate any projections as to what the superannuation fund should look like. If we could do that based on the information provided to us. And then there was another angle in this case where we were asked to provide our opinion. If there was some documents that we had received that if the handwriting on the document, belonged to potentially the late father. So, procedures performed, again, having discussions with the client, which is very, very important to understand what's happened, what information's available, what we can do with it, and then having discussions with the law firm also to see what other information we can collect. And the more information we have, the more evidence we have, the better it is in any investigation or forensic accounting engagement. So we got all the relevant documentation, and if we just move to the next slide there, please.
Melinda, just giving you a wind up of you got a minute.
Perfect. I got a minute really quickly. So what do we perform analysis on? Lots of information, like I mentioned, real estate records, bank records. They had lots and lots of bank accounts, 12 accounts in all, vehicle records, etc. So, but what do we find critically for our client was, evidence of misappropriation. We could see transfer of funds from the late father's bank accounts to unknown bank accounts, which our client had no clue about. There was also evidence that, sale of shares was deposited into another person, the wife's account. So really good findings for the client that they could take to court. And I've got one more slide to go before I hand it over to Roger. And it's that the key takeaway is, look, forensic accountants, we are your friends. If there's anything that, is a red flag that you see within the organization, consider engaging, lawyers, and there'll be lawyers on this webinar today, and engage with your forensic investigators, your accountants, to where we can help you. And I'll hand it over to Roger.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Really appreciate it, Michael, Andrew, Melinda. And, you've probably seen pretty clearly what do we do at RSM, Australia's Fraud and Forensic Services. And we've covered quite a few of those different areas. By the way, the term OSINT means open source intelligence, checking and gathering of information. Next slide, please. So now, any questions? I've been looking at the Q&A, and there is one for you, Andrew, that in terms of the New South Wales Police referrals, in terms of serious indictable offence, is there a good definition of what that is? The industry that I work in, being health insurance, the fact that we have to refer in New South Wales is often touted, but often the fraud will be low value, and if we do refer, there is little interest. So I'm looking for some guidance that might help determine threshold.
Thanks, Roger. And Kerry, I think that's a two-pronged question. I'll do my best to answer that, and more than happy to have a discussion after this webinar. No obligation, so give me a call or send me an email. But firstly, what is a serious indictable offence? Well, that's defined as any offence that is punishable for at least 5 years imprisonment or more. So that's number one. And then secondly, so for example, larceny, the offence of larceny in New South Wales, that carries an offence of 5 years imprisonment. It doesn't mean that any offender charged with a simple shoplifting matter will receive 5 years, but the fact the offence carries 5 years of imprisonment means that would be an example that would fall under that legislative provision there that I mentioned earlier. Secondly, in respect of New South Wales Police and their investigations, methodology and prosecution guidelines, there wouldn't be a hard and fast rule in terms of what threshold would be a fraud that they would take on. It's very subjective, and it will differ from police station to police station. But my advice would be the better police referral you can put together in terms of its completeness, and it has statements or summaries that clearly articulate all the proofs or all the different elements required to meet the benchmark for a fraud to be established at a criminal level. So remember that not civil disputes, it really needs to be criminal. And if it's of a sufficient threshold, as in, I don't want to throw an arbitrary number out there, or it's systemic fraud, they would be more inclined to take that on. But more than happy to have a discussion after this.
Thanks, Andrew. I might go to Matt's question for you, Michael. Re corporate credit cards, any use of loyalty programs such as flybys detected resulting in personal gain?
No, I haven't, but it's an interesting one, certainly in the government space. What is your policies and procedures around the use of any points, Qantas points, or any of those flybys in the use of the card if it's attached to it? Because ultimately it's taxpayers' money or company money being used in the first instance to make the purchase. So what's the policies and procedures around the individuals then using it for themselves at a later date? So I haven't seen anything, but it's a very topical question, and it would go back to your credit card usage policy and what you'd have in there on that. I'd expect to see something if your credit card is linked, like to Qantas or another scheme where you can then actually have a benefit.
So we might finish up. We're bang on. Andrew, your comment is thank you for your praise. A very helpful session today. And there are a lot of overlaps with cybersecurity, governance, risk and compliance, and organisational risk management. Totally agree. So we'll leave it there because we want to finish on time. We have answered a couple of people's questions directly, which you may see in the Q&A or may not. And really appreciate your time. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and the slides, and happy to follow up with you. And we probably will at least follow up with as many people as we can to say, would you like to have a coffee catch up and talk bespoke about your own organisation? We wish you a great festive season and break when you get there at the end of next month, and it is happening very quickly. and wish you a great International Fraud Awareness Week. And thank you to our marketing team and also to my co-speakers today. Thank you all.